The chamber was tense, the kind of tension that made every cough echo like thunder. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the clash that was about to unfold. Tim Scott leaned forward, his tone sharp, his words deliberate, slicing across Jasmine Crockett's sentence like a blade. "You can't even defend your own record," he snapped, his voice carrying the smug confidence of someone who thought he'd already won. The room fell into a hush. Crockett's lips pressed together, but it wasn't defeat. It was composure. Her eyes locked onto his with the calm of someone who had weathered storms far greater than this man's interruption. The pause was long enough to make even the sound technicians shift nervously in their seats. Viewers at home leaned in. The air was electric, the kind of live TV suspense that made thumbs freeze over the comment button. Scott smirked, mistaking her silence for surrender. He leaned back, shaking his head as if to say, "See, nothing to add." But that's when the shift began. Crockett's chin lifted just slightly, a glimmer of steel flashing in her eyes. She hadn't been silenced, she had been calculating. Every camera lens captured it, the villain basking in his arrogance, the hero preparing her strike. He had tried to embarrass her in front of the nation. He thought cutting her off, dismissing her with a single sentence would humiliate her into silence. But silence can be powerful, and Crockett knew exactly how to wield it. Her breath was steady, her voice low but deliberate when it finally came. "Senator," she said, every syllable dripping with restrained force, "if you think talking over me proves your point, then maybe you've already lost the argument." Gasps rippled across the room. Some chuckled nervously, others whispered as if they had just witnessed a spark ignite a fuse. Scott blinked, caught off guard by the sharpness wrapped in calm. The smirk faltered, if only for a heartbeat. That was all Crockett needed, the briefest crack in his armor. Because what she was about to deliver wouldn't just answer his insult. It would redefine the moment, flipping the power dynamic on live television. And as America watched, holding its breath, one question filled the air: what will she say next? The exchange wasn't happening in some quiet committee room. It was unfolding under the unforgiving glare of the national spotlight. Millions were watching, some live, others through the countless clips that would soon flood social media. Every word carried weight, every pause carried meaning. Tim Scott knew that too. He sharpened his tone, pressing forward with the confidence of someone who had been trained to dominate a stage. He gestured grandly, as if lecturing not just Crockett but the entire country. "This isn't about personal feelings," he declared. "This is about accountability, something you clearly struggle with." The words hung heavy. They weren't just aimed at her record. They carried an undertone, a coded jab that suggested she didn't belong, that she wasn't capable of meeting the standards he alone defined. For Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't merely another political insult. It was a direct challenge to her dignity, and by extension to the dignity of everyone who had ever been underestimated, interrupted, or told they weren't enough. The stakes were no longer just about who won a debate point. They had expanded into something much larger, a clash over identity, respect, and the right to be heard in America's most sacred halls of power. Viewers at home felt it. The scrolling live comments on news streams lit up. "He's trying to silence her. She better not let that slide. This is why representation matters." Scott doubled down, convinced that he had her cornered. "If you can't handle tough questions here, how can the American people trust you?" His words dripped with practiced authority, the kind meant to trigger doubt and discredit. But Crockett wasn't just representing herself. She was carrying the voices of people who knew this tactic well, the belittling, the interruptions, the attempts to shrink someone into silence. And that awareness gave her power. The room seemed to bend under the tension. Journalists exchanged knowing looks. Staffers shifted uncomfortably. The moment was teetering, ready to tip into something unforgettable. Because what Crockett chose to do next wouldn't just defend her reputation. It would send a message to every young woman, every immigrant family, every marginalized voice watching at home: you can try to dismiss us, but we are not going anywhere. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was about America deciding whose voices mattered in the nation's story. And as Crockett drew in a breath, preparing to answer, the weight of that decision seemed to hang in the air like a storm about to break. The cameras zoomed closer. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes steady. The audience, both in the chamber and across the country, leaned forward, waiting for the crack of thunder. Because if the last exchange had been a spark, what was coming next threatened to set the whole debate ablaze. Tim Scott had always worn the armor of composure. To the casual observer, he seemed the picture of polished professionalism, calm voice, carefully measured phrases, the sort of presence designed to reassure audiences that he was the reasonable adult in the room. For years, this cultivated image had been his greatest weapon. It allowed him to slip past criticism, to paint himself as above the fray even when he was very much in it. But beneath that polished mask lay a different reality, one that critics had long pointed out. Scott's brand was built on saying all the right things to the right people, while quietly aligning himself with policies that undermined the very communities he claimed to uplift. He was fluent in the language of unity, yet his record often whispered a harsher story. He could smile while endorsing measures that chipped away at equality. He could laugh while defending those who treated dignity as optional. That duality, the mask and the man behind it, was what made this clash with Jasmine Crockett so explosive. On the surface, he was simply doing what he always did, deflecting, interrupting, trying to establish dominance without raising his voice. But to those who had studied his methods, the move was all too familiar. It was the polished mask at work, using charm and poise as camouflage for condescension. In the chamber, that mask was firmly in place. His tone was courteous enough, his smile quick and practiced, but the barbs underneath were unmistakable. He wasn't just challenging Crockett's policy positions, he was undermining her very right to speak with authority, and that, more than any single sentence, revealed the cracks in his carefully built persona. Because arrogance doesn't always roar, sometimes it whispers, sometimes it interrupts with a smirk, sometimes it cloaks itself in civility while trying to silence those who threaten its power. The irony was that Scott's mask had worked so well for so long that he didn't notice when it began to slip. Viewers watching from home weren't buying the polished act anymore. They saw through the careful posture and the performative patience. What they saw was a man rattled by a woman who refused to yield. They saw insecurity dressed up as authority. And that's the danger of masks. Once they start to crack, the whole facade risks collapse. The smirk that had once read as confidence now seemed smug. The interruptions that once passed as toughness now looked like desperation. The polished mask, instead of protecting him, was beginning to betray him. This was the villain's contradiction laid bare. A man who prided himself on being untouchable, suddenly revealed as deeply vulnerable because dignity cannot be faked and authority cannot be sustained by arrogance alone. Scott's mistake wasn't just in interrupting Crockett, it was in underestimating her. He assumed his mask would hold, that his reputation as the calm, composed senator would carry him through unscathed. But Crockett wasn't the type to play the role he had written for her. She wasn't going to shrink. She wasn't going to let his polished mask convince the world that she didn't belong. And that set the stage for what was to come. Because when the mask slips, when the performance no longer convinces, the audience begins to root for its collapse. They wait for the moment when truth shatters pretense. And Jasmine Crockett was more than ready to deliver that shattering blow. The cameras were rolling, the room was alive with anticipation, the polished mask was starting to crack. And once it did, there would be no putting it back together again. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in that chamber by accident. Her presence, her poise, her very voice carried with it the weight of years of struggle and the quiet strength of someone who had been told, no, more times than most people ever hear yes. To understand why she sat so firmly, so unshaken in the face of Tim Scott's attack, you had to understand the fire that forged her. She grew up in a world where nothing was handed to her. Every achievement was earned with persistence, every opportunity carved out against the grain of doubt. As a young woman, she knew what it meant to stand in rooms where people assumed she didn't belong. She knew the sting of being underestimated, the dismissive glances, the sideways comments that carried more venom than the words themselves. And each time she turned that sting into fuel. Her journey into law was not glamorous. It was grueling, marked by long nights, heavy books, and the relentless need to prove herself not just as competent but as exceptional. She understood early on that for someone like her, average would never be enough. She had to be twice as prepared, twice as sharp, twice as resilient. That became her creed, her armor, and eventually her gift. When she entered public service, she did so not with illusions of power but with a deep conviction that voices like hers mattered. She stood for the people whose stories were rarely told, for communities brushed aside in the grand narratives of American politics. She carried their frustrations, their hopes, their resilience into every chamber she entered. To her, politics was never a game. It was survival, it was dignity, it was justice clawed out of a system that too often denied it. This was the fire Tim Scott didn't see when he interrupted her. He saw only the surface, a woman he assumed he could talk over, dismiss, reduce to a soundbite, but beneath that calm exterior burned the memory of every slight, every barrier, every voice that had tried to tell her she was less than worthy. That fire didn't weaken her, it sharpened her. Her supporters knew this story. They admired her not simply because she spoke boldly, but because they saw themselves in her. She was proof that struggle could be transformed into strength, that silence could be turned into defiance, that dignity could triumph over dismissal. She wasn't just a representative, she was a mirror reflecting back to millions the truth that their stories, too, had power. And that was the deeper threat to Scott, because Crockett wasn't simply defending herself in that chamber. She was carrying the fire of every immigrant family who worked twice as hard for half the recognition, of every young woman who had been interrupted and ignored, of every person who had been told to wait their turn while watching others leap ahead. That's why her silence after his jab had felt so heavy, so charged. She wasn't calculating how to protect her ego. She was weighing how to speak not only for herself but for all those who had been silenced before. That responsibility gave her words their edge, it gave her presence its gravity. And it made her clapback inevitable. The irony is that Scott believed he was engaging in politics as usual, a sharp exchange, a well-timed interruption, a chance to assert control. What he failed to recognize was that he had stepped into a narrative much larger than himself. Crockett's backstory wasn't just about one woman's rise. It was about a movement, about voices long pushed to the margins demanding to be heard. Every camera in that chamber was about to capture the moment when that fire, forged over years of struggle, erupted into brilliance. She wasn't simply answering his insult. She was preparing to flip the script of the entire debate. Because when someone like Jasmine Crockett speaks, it is never just personal, it is generational. And as she drew in her breath, her eyes unwavering, the fire that had carried her this far was about to burn through every mask, every interruption, every doubt. The room didn't know it yet, but it was about to witness not just a clapback, but a reckoning. The first interruption came swiftly, almost casually. Tim Scott leaned in with the air of someone who believed control was his birthright. "That's not even relevant," he cut across, dismissing Crockett before she had completed her thought. The words were sharp, but it was the gesture, the quick wave of his hand that revealed the deeper intent. It wasn't disagreement, it was dismissal. Crockett didn't flinch. She paused, allowed the interruption to land, and then resumed, steady as ever. Her calm only seemed to irritate him further. The second interruption followed within seconds. No, answer the question," Scott demanded, voice rising just enough to dominate the room. This time his tone carried the edge of accusation. He wasn't seeking clarity, he was asserting dominance. Again, Crockett waited. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was patience weaponized. By the third interruption, murmurs stirred in the chamber. Journalists exchanged glances. Viewers at home could feel the imbalance building. The familiar pattern of a woman being denied the space to finish her sentence. Scott leaned back with a smirk, convinced he was tightening the screws. "You're dodging, Congresswoman," he taunted. But it was he who looked rattled. The fourth interruption was louder, tinged with frustration. "Stop spinning!" His voice cracked just slightly, betraying the strain of someone trying too hard to maintain control. Crockett kept her composure, letting his outburst hang in the air. The audience could sense the shift, arrogance curdling into desperation. By the fifth, his interruptions had lost their veneer of professionalism. He leaned forward, talking over her, insisting, "You can't run from the truth." But the irony was obvious. The truth he feared was the one she was about to unleash. The sixth interruption was the breaking point. His voice, sharper than before, carried not authority but panic. "You're out of line," he snapped. But in that moment it was clear to everyone watching that it was Crockett who was out of line, it was Scott, unraveling in plain view. The chamber had transformed into a boiling pot. Each interruption was another bubble rising to the surface, the pressure building with nowhere left to go. Crockett's restraint was no longer just composure. It was strategy, a deliberate choice to let Scott reveal himself, to let the villain write his own downfall. And the audience, in the room, at home, across the nation, felt it viscerally. They weren't just hearing interruptions. They were witnessing a pattern, one that echoed their own experiences, being silenced, being talked over, being denied respect. Every jab at Crockett landed like a jab at them. That's why the tension was unbearable. Something had to break. The fire Crockett carried, the patience she wielded, the dignity she embodied, all of it was building toward the moment when silence would turn into thunder. And then, just as Scott leaned in for what he believed would be the knockout blow, Crockett's eyes sharpened, her lips parted, the room leaned forward. Because after 6 interruptions, after all the arrogance and dismissal, the 7th exchange was not going to be like the rest. It was going to silence him. The chamber held its breath. 6 interruptions had tested the patience of every observer, every viewer, every supporter who had endured moments like this in their own lives. And then, as Tim Scott prepared to lunge in again, Jasmine Crockett struck. Her voice was calm, low, almost too measured at first, the kind of tone that forces the listener to lean in to catch every syllable. "Senator," she began, her gaze never wavering, "you've interrupted me 6 times. 6. She lifted a hand, fingers splayed, pausing before folding them one by one. "And each time you've proven less about me and more about you." A ripple moved across the chamber. The statement was not loud, but its resonance was undeniable. It was not the voice of someone rattled, it was the voice of someone in control. Scott blinked, his smirk twitching as if unsure whether to stay or fade. He opened his mouth, but Crockett didn't allow him space. She leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "You accuse me of dodging, but the truth is you can't stand to hear me answer, because an answer from me does more damage to your argument than silence ever could." Gasps rose from the audience. A few chuckles slipped out. The villain's mask had cracked and the cameras caught every flicker of discomfort on his face. Crockett continued, her cadence deliberate, each phrase crafted like a blade. "You claim to stand for accountability, then let's talk about accountability. Let's talk about the record, not the spin, not the performance, but the facts." She drew in a breath and let the pause settle like a drumbeat before the crescendo. "Your record." The silence that followed was electric. Even Scott didn't dare cut across her now. She pivoted, layering her attack with precision. "You have stood on stages and promised fairness while voting for policies that strip fairness away. You've spoken about opportunity while defending systems that deny opportunity to entire communities. You preach accountability, but when pressed, you hide behind interruptions because the truth terrifies you more than my voice ever could." Scott's jaw tightened. He shifted in his chair, searching for the posture that might reassert control, but the cameras betrayed him. They captured the unease, the dart of his eyes, the falter of his once steady demeanor. And Crockett pressed on. "My record," she gestured toward herself. "It's not perfect, but it is mine, built from sleepless nights fighting for people who don't have lobbyists, for families who can't afford to sit in these cushioned chairs and still dream of a fairer future. My record is standing in rooms where voices like mine were never meant to be heard and refusing to sit down." A murmur swelled into scattered applause. The sound was restrained at first, as though people feared breaking protocol. But Crockett's words had pierced the formality of the chamber, and passion has a way of defying rules. She looked directly at Scott now, her voice rising though never losing its control. "You thought you could silence me with smirks and interruptions, but silence has been used as a weapon against people like me for generations. And today, I'm not silent. Today I'm loud enough for everyone who has ever been told to wait their turn, to stay in their place, to stop talking." The crowd reacted, gasps, nods, a few audible yes calls that cut through the tension. Scott shifted again, his composure unraveling thread by thread. Crockett delivered the final blow, her words crisp, her tone ironclad. "You wanted to embarrass me, but the only thing you've managed to reveal is your fear. Fear of my voice, fear of the truth, fear that this chamber, this country is changing and that people like me aren't going anywhere." A thunderclap of reaction filled the room. Applause broke past the restraints. Some rose to their feet while others simply sat in stunned silence. On social media, clips of the exchange were already being posted, hashtags already forming. Scott sat back, his smirk gone, his armor shattered. He searched for a response, but no words came. The cameras caught it, the stillness of a man speechless, undone not by volume but by the piercing force of dignity. Crockett, meanwhile, didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her face remained composed, her tone steady as she concluded. "Now, Senator, if you'd like to have a real debate, I'll be here, but if all you've got left is interruptions, I think we're finished." The silence that followed was almost cinematic. Every microphone picked it up, every viewer felt it through their screens. It wasn't just a clapback, it was a reckoning. And beyond the chamber walls, the reaction was already spreading. Phones buzzed, tweets flew. And millions who had ever felt silenced were finding validation in her words. The mic drop moment had arrived, the villain had crumbled, the hero had risen. But the true shockwave was only just beginning. As the chamber emptied and the debate cameras went dark, the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's words lingered like a shockwave. Within minutes, social media exploded. Clips of her calm, calculated clapback were circulating faster than any politician could control. Hashtags began trending. Crockett claps back, #dignity over disrespect, speechless Scott. Commentators dissected every syllable, every pause, every sharp glance that had punctuated her delivery. Viewers at home weren't just watching a debate, they were witnessing a symbolic victory. Those who had been repeatedly interrupted in boardrooms, classrooms, and public meetings felt a surge of validation. Crockett had voiced what many had been too afraid to articulate. Her words weren't just a comeback, they were a mirror reflecting the frustration and resilience of millions. Political pundits scrambled to respond. Analysts praised her composure, comparing her performance to moments in history when individuals had stood unflinchingly against intimidation. Even journalists who typically maintain neutrality found themselves drawn to the moral clarity of her response. Each headline captured the drama. Crockett's calm devastates Scott, 6 interruptions, 1 epic clapback, dignity triumphs in the chamber. Memes and GIFs exploded across platforms. Clips of Scott blinking in disbelief were paired with text highlighting the power of Crockett's words. TikTok users recreated the scene, emphasizing her poise and timing. For every insult that Scott had hurled, there were thousands of shares amplifying Crockett's moral and intellectual victory. Celebrities and influencers joined the conversation. Some tweeted praise for her eloquence and courage, while others shared personal anecdotes of similar moments when they had been talked over or dismissed. Crockett's moment became not just political theater, but a cultural touchstone. It reminded the nation that eloquence paired with integrity can disrupt arrogance at the highest levels. Within Congress, whispers spread. Fellow legislators, many of whom had observed the tension firsthand, exchanged knowing looks. Some approached Crockett privately, offering congratulations and acknowledging the courage required to maintain composure under such sustained provocation. Her performance shifted the dynamics of the chamber, earning her newfound respect even from those who were previously skeptical of her approach. Meanwhile, Scott faced an unprecedented scrutiny. Analysts debated his interruptions, dissecting the subtle insecurities revealed beneath his polished exterior. Pundits questioned whether his tactics had backfired, inadvertently spotlighting Crockett's competence and moral authority. What had begun as a routine confrontation had transformed into a national conversation about power, respect, and the ethics of debate. Across the country, ordinary citizens joined in. Parents shared clips with their children, teachers used the moment as an example of advocacy and resilience, and social media threads brimmed with discussions about dignity, representation, and standing one's ground. Crockett's victory became communal. It was not just hers, but a triumph that resonated with anyone who had ever been underestimated. And yet, for all the praise, there was an underlying suspense. Everyone sensed that this was only the beginning. Crockett had made her point, but the implications of her words, the ripple effect, were still unfolding. Political commentators predicted the debates to come, the reactions from Scott's allies, and the broader societal dialogue that her courage had ignited. The nation watched, captivated, as a single moment of composure had transformed into a symbol of resilience and empowerment. Crockett's performance didn't just end with applause, it sparked a movement, a reminder that dignity cannot be interrupted and that truth, once spoken, has a momentum all its own. The aftermath was clear. The chamber had witnessed history in miniature, social media had amplified it into a cultural event, and the country had collectively felt the impact. And yet, even as the buzz swelled, one question lingered in every mind: what would happen next? In the quiet that followed the storm, the weight of Jasmine Crockett's words settled over the nation. The applause, the hashtags, the viral clips, they were all echoes of a deeper truth. Dignity cannot be silenced, and courage is louder than arrogance. Crockett had not just defended herself, she had reminded every viewer why representation matters, why voices long ignored deserve to be heard, and why integrity always outlasts intimidation. Her performance reframed the entire confrontation. What had begun as a personal clash between two politicians became a lesson in resilience for the country. It was a reminder that those who wield power without empathy are always vulnerable when faced with moral clarity. Crockett's calm yet incisive delivery had turned Scott's repeated interruptions into a mirror, reflecting back his fear, his desperation, and his inability to confront truth without bluster. For the audience, the lesson was immediate and visceral. They saw that courage is not loudness and that standing your ground is not aggression, it is strength. In every school, every living room, and every workplace where viewers replayed the moment, Crockett's example resonated. People felt validated for their own struggles, their own interruptions, their own silences. She had spoken not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been denied the space to speak. Beyond the applause and viral clips, there was a moral clarity that transcended politics. The story was no longer about a single debate or a single insult. It was about what America values. It was about the principles of respect, fairness, and equality. Crockett had transformed a moment of potential humiliation into a showcase of integrity, turning personal confrontation into universal insight. Her victory was not measured in ratings or social media trends, but in the quiet, enduring affirmation it gave to millions. It was a demonstration that preparation, empathy, and moral courage create a force far stronger than interruptions, smirks, or rehearsed speeches. It proved that true leadership is built on listening, understanding, and speaking with conviction when it matters most. And yet, the crescendo of her moment carried a forward-looking message. This was not the end of the story, it was a spark igniting conversations and inspiring action. Crockett's clarity, her unwavering stance, and her refusal to be diminished became a blueprint for those seeking change, for those demanding that dignity be respected in every arena. Her words reminded everyone that every voice counts. And that standing firm, even against intimidation, can reshape the conversation and redefine the rules of engagement. As the nation absorbed the moment, one truth became undeniable: arrogance may interrupt, but it cannot overcome authenticity. Polished masks crumble when met with integrity. Loud interruptions fade when countered by prepared, principled speech. And courage, when wielded with conviction, resonates far beyond the confines of a single chamber. In the end, Jasmine Crockett had turned an attack into empowerment, an insult into inspiration, and a fleeting debate into a defining cultural moment. The chamber might have emptied, the cameras might have switched off, but the impact of her words, the moral lesson, would echo long after, reminding the nation that dignity always wins over disrespect. The question lingered, softly but insistently. In a world so often dominated by interruption and noise, how many more voices would now find the courage to speak, knowing that their words could carry the power of truth? The chamber had emptied, the debate concluded, but the moment lingered far beyond its walls. Jasmine Crockett had not only defended herself, she had redefined what it meant to stand with dignity under pressure. Tim Scott's interruptions, once meant to dominate, had only amplified her composure and conviction. The world had witnessed a lesson in courage, resilience, and moral clarity. Viewers at home felt it immediately. For anyone who had been silenced, talked over, or dismissed, Crockett's words were a mirror and a promise. Your voice matters, and your truth can never be taken from you. Her example reminded everyone that integrity is a far more powerful tool than intimidation, that preparation paired with moral courage can turn any confrontation into a triumph. And now the story extends beyond this single debate. It's an invitation to action. Every like, every share, every comment carries the potential to spread this moment further, to inspire others to speak, to stand, and to insist that dignity always has its place. This isn't just a video. It's a movement, a reminder that America is strongest when all voices are heard and respected. So, if you believe in courage over arrogance, in truth over interruption, in dignity over disrespect, subscribe, share, and be part of the conversation. Let Jasmine Crockett's moment be a call to all who have ever been told to stay silent. Your voice has power. Speak it, amplify it, and never let anyone make you feel smaller than you are. Because moments like these aren't just watched, they're lived, shared, and remembered. And together, we can make sure the world never forgets the lesson she taught in that chamber.